So welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast. This is where we explore the new game-changing understanding that can unlock new levels of performance, resourcefulness, and well-being in the workplace. Join us if you want to be part of the new breed of leaders in business. Join us if you're fed up with the conventional echo chamber. And join us if you want to be part of the new revolution in understanding how the mind works and recognize that we are more than just our psychology and that can lead to better results.
Hello and welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast series. And today's episode, I've got a really rather special conversation lined up, one I've been sort of waiting to do for a couple of years, or maybe even more than that, because my guest is Mark Lund, who has recently retired from his role in the business world, which I'll tell you all about. And I've had the privilege and pleasure with working with Mark over the last 6 years around quality of mind. And now we get a chance to do a podcast episode to find out what it was all like for him and his team. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Piers.
Mark, could you give listeners just a couple of minutes overview of, well, actually, you might need more than 2 minutes because it's probably quite a rich career, but can you just give a potted history of your life and how you've got to this day so far?
Yeah, of course. So as Piers said, my name is Mark Lund, and Lund sounds very sort of Swedish stroke Yorkshire, but it hides the fact that although half of me is sort of Scandinavian British, the other half is sort of Czech, Italian, German, European. So I'm kind of a slightly more exotic blend or mongrel underneath than I might look. And that sort of, that's kind of slightly shaped my experience. I've worked mostly in the UK, but also in France. And for the last few years of working with McCann, where Piers and I met, I was managing a European business as well as a UK business. And my life has been, my professional life has been spent in marketing and advertising, and I've worked for, I've worked for and set up and founded and run marketing services agencies of various sorts. I've also worked for the British government, running their Central Office Information, which is the marketing and behaviour change centre for the government. And my sort of intellectual interest in marketing and advertising has always been, how you can understand people better and how you can work with them to kind of promote the sort of the behaviors or the behavior changes that seem best. And that's been very fascinating, both in commercial and in sort of societal change ways. And I spent the last 8 years of that career running the McCann World Group business in the UK and then in Europe, which is the biggest sort of marketing services group in the region. And that was, fascinating challenge. And that was where Piers and I started to work together.
Well, Mark, you've had an illustrious career, I think. You're very modest. And listeners, we could probably talk about lots of things to Mark, but of course, as is the want of quality of mind, we want to dive into the mind and what that's all about. Now, Mark, can you cast your mind back to when you first came across, I think it was probably 6 years ago, this notion of quality of mind? And can you remember what it was that got you first interested in it and why you decided to embark on a program with your then senior leadership team?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the business challenge that I had when I joined in 2014 was pretty simple. We had about 10 different companies in the UK, all of which were pretty good individually, and which, if you added them up together, made this, this really quite large 2,500 people business. But they saw themselves very much as 10 individual companies. And the sort of the challenge for me as the head of McCann World Group, which is all the companies, was to try and bring them together so that the sort of sum of the parts added up to more than the individual totals. And that was very difficult because there were a whole series of historic and kind of craft differences between them, and long memories of sort of slights and injustices, and sort of sense of inferiority, superiority, all of which made the collaboration process much more difficult. Um, and and what I was looking for was a transformative experience that we could go through together, and sort of hopefully start to see that the collective was more powerful than the individual. Um, and we had a very brilliant head of learning and development at the time, who had worked, I think, with one of Piers's colleagues in the past. And she recommended this process to me as a way of starting to bond this team. And I'd been there for about a year, and had started the process in my own kind of slightly amateurish way, but we weren't making that much progress. So we needed something that was a breakthrough. And that was how we found ourselves at the very beginning of 2016 in a sort of, the classic empty conference room with a circle of chairs, confronting 3 days of quality of mind. And I'd sold this to my, kind of slightly cynical management, or what I saw as slightly cynical management, as, this is a way of us making better decisions together and better decisions individually and running our businesses better. And we did it right at the very beginning of the year, so that it was 3 days, but on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of January, nothing is happening. So there's sort of a way of getting people out of the business for that length of time. And so that was how we found ourselves, sort of working with Piers for the first time, and embarking on what was really quite a big leap into the unknown, because what I subsequently realized was that I kind of utterly believed in Eva, who was our head of L&D, and I'd been very impressed by Piers in terms of talking to him about the process before. But if you'd really pinned me down and said, what are you actually going to do, other than it being about quality of mind, I'd have been completely lost, because I actually didn't know.
It's funny that, because often, actually, the more people want to know beforehand, the more that's unhelpful. I think there was something that you obviously resonated with about what we talked about, and you didn't need to know the literal mechanics of how we were going to do it. You just got a sense, and you went with what some people might even call your intuition, that it was the right thing to do. So if we now nip to the benefits, and that was the start of quite a lot of work we did together, but what would you say now? How do you articulate the shift that it was able to create for, let's start with the team, and then we'll come to you as an individual later.
Yeah, that bit is now looks simple and kind of very, very defined. Because obviously the thing that got me sort of interested in it in the first place was this sense of quality of mind. Because in a creative service business, that the ability to bring better quality of mind to a whole series of moments and events is absolutely crucial. How to analyzing a problem sort of effectively, reading a room, and and sort of the emotions of someone you're talking to, knowing whether an idea, strategic or creative, is a good one. All of those are incredibly intuitive things. They actually don't benefit from overthinking. And they also benefit from being done in the moment, in a flow. And so that sense of, if we could improve our quality of mind, it would obviously make us better individual business people. But I also had this sense that if we could improve our quality of mind, we'd start to see the benefit of each other more, and therefore start to bring down some of the silos and walls that were between the individual businesses. And that would kind of create this sort of more powerful collective. And I think, if you look back on it now, nearly 7 years, in fact, after we first started working together, the business has not only grown significantly. I mean, the UK business is probably 50% bigger than it was than in 2016, and much more, much more effective, much more productive, much more profitable. But the sense that the people have of being part of this overall identity of World Group, as opposed to simply a McCann office here or an MRM office there, is palpable. And that was the thing that I thought could transform us. And that, I think, is the thing that has transformed us. And the prototype, the model that's been developed in the UK, is now seen as a very effective one all around the McCann world. So it's actually, to be fair, it's succeeded far better than I could possibly, as we sat in that circle back in January in 2016, possibly have imagined. And I think we owe Quality of Mind and Piers a lot for that.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. So just moving now from the organizational benefits to you as an individual, because I always say that benefit is individual as well as collective. What have you noticed in your life, home, work, that Quality of Mind enabled you to realize?
Yeah, I think it's two or three sort of really significant things. The first is that in effect, we make the world as opposed to the world making us. Once you start seeing yourself as a projector as opposed to a camera, the sense that you can't always affect events, but you can absolutely affect your response to those events and the meaning you put upon those events. And that ultimately gives the individual a huge amount of power, because you're not shaped by what is happening. You're shaped by how you react to and interpret what's happening. And that suddenly frees you up from kind of the tyranny of cause and effect. So that's the first massive thing. The second thing, I think, is the sense of the universal mind and the sort of the benevolent intelligence that sort of fills the universe. And the metaphor of having an aperture, which is either more open or more closed to that kind of benevolent universal intelligence, is very helpful, because the tendency always, when things are difficult, you're under pressure of any sort, is to kind of, is to literally tense up, close up, and shut the world out and try and solve it by yourself. And for me, as an individual who's always been comparatively self-reliant, that is kind of absolutely hardwired. So the idea that you could treat yourself not as a highly memoried and sort of reasoned up laptop, but as more of a dumb terminal, which kind of lets the universal intelligence and benevolence in, was fantastically helpful for me. Because again, it allowed me to let go of, that sort of pressure to be the person who made all the decisions, and to go with the flow more, and to allow things to happen more. And that in turn made life not only more enjoyable, but also made a lot of the decisions I made probably better than they would have been otherwise. And then the third big thing for me is, about thought and how we attach, meaning to things. And again, if you're a sort of thoughtful, intelligent person, you tend to, and I do this, I tend to overthink everything, and I tend to kind of attach way too much meaning as to why something happened and why didn't I do that, and that becomes very destructive. And the sense of being able to observe something and not attach meaning to it, not therefore be kind of tyrannized by it as a sort of an underlier or kind of prover of existing patterns of some sort, is very, very helpful, because it stops me from being distracted, and it allows me to stay in the moment much more, rather than being dragged into recrimination or regret or any of those other sort of slightly kind of corrosive emotions. So there are lots of other things, but as an individual, those are the three big things that I've kind of taken out of it.
I mean, there's a huge amount in what you said that I could unpick there, Mark. And has anything over the sort of 5-6 years that you've looked at this, Mark, for you individually, has anything sort of surprised you in what you've started seeing, noticing about yourself or the world, which you might sort of then trace back to your new worldview?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of the most powerful and interesting things which I see is the sort of sense of not needing to try and anticipate and sort of almost pre-influence events in quite the way that I did. And obviously, if you're kind of trying to sort of shape the world almost in advance as you go, it's very hard work. And that, that generally tends to come because you're seeing the world very mechanistically and you're seeing it very much from your own point of view. Once you have a greater sense of, the sort of the sense of the universal intelligence, and B, the idea that what's happening is kind of as much what you're making it as opposed to what is actually happening, then you're able to react much more relaxedly in the moment to events. And that is both more effective, but it's also much less tiring. And the number of conversations that I've had in the last few years where previously I would have started to panic very early on about where is this conversation going? I've got to head this off. This is going to be a disaster. And I've kind of let it unfold and develop. And in the moment, allowed my quality of mind to stay high and my aperture to remain open, and then found a way of changing the course of the conversation in a way that felt productive and good. That's been very effective. And what I realize is that, my sense of imminent catastrophe or disaster in that conversation before was as much to do with my own fear as opposed to any intention or malevolence from the other person. And by not going that way, the conversation never gets into a difficult place in the first place and resolves itself very happily. So that sense of being in the moment and allowing things to happen is very, for me, it's been very powerful. And for me, it's taken a lot of the sort of stress out of sort of the more difficult negotiations and kind of confrontations that any business, any life involves.
I think you just nicely described what some people might describe as flow state, which is often talked about in music or dance or art or sport, but rarely in business. Well, it's starting to be talked about in business, but I think what's wonderful is it's not a state that's all useless and ineffective and unpleasant, but not getting anywhere. It actually, I think, does two things. It helps with, it's less tiring, so there's less burnout coming, and you actually get to a sense of where you get to do more with less, because the periphery just dissolves down and you become quite focused. Even though it's flow, it's quite focused, and that's all about well-being and productivity.
Yeah, that sort of flow state, which athletes talk about, I think is absolutely as true for a presentation or a conversation, or a thought process that you're engaged in with other people, as it is for skiing down a mountain or driving a lap of a Formula One circuit. And quite aside from the sort of effectiveness or productivity of it, there's also that sense of joy and kind of almost grace that you get when you do move into it. And it sounds sort of slightly pathetic to say, well, you can get into flow while having a conversation about marketing, but you can, and it's as glorious when you do, as if your friends clamor, sort of doing the kit spill. So I think that is it's a sign, it's a massively important extra benefit.
Yeah, so you're almost getting more juice out of each moment, so you don't have to get bigger moments. You get more satisfaction, more presence, more fulfillment, inspiration from whatever you're doing. whether it's a very fascinating thing or not, and having a cup of tea or just chatting to some friends about marketing. So I think that's about the richness of life that's available that we don't always see because we're slightly numb to it, and it sort of wakes that up. And I think that those things are useful for any human being, but particularly for leaders. And I remember us having a conversation at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 and just being totally in awe of your mindset about the pandemic, which was incredibly open apertured. Even though clients were panicking, you were potentially losing business and everything was just shut down. And you had the most beautiful outlook on it, which, you know, is not one you could artificially create. I really felt that that's what you saw in that moment, that you were like, well, we are where we are and we'll do what we need to do. And this could actually be a good thing for us. And it was just the most amazing conversation. I don't know if you remember it, but I thought, that's really quality of mind in action.
Yeah. And I think that it's very interesting because, you know, the sort of, if I compare the way that I felt about Brexit versus the pandemic, I was much more kind of worried, cast down, you know, affected by the sort of the Brexit decision, which I regarded as being, and still do, as being kind of, you know, not a great decision. But I found it much harder to see the possibility in that. Whereas by the time, you know, 4 or 5 years later, by the time we got to the pandemic, it was possible. I found it possible to see much more potential for, if this is going to happen, how do we live with it? How do we kind of almost turn it to our advantage, rather than sort of just simply be oppressed by the fact that it's there, and you know, and the sort of undeniable anxiety and misery and sort of fear that it created.
Yeah, and that's actually a nice comparison, sort of pre-quality of mind, post-quality of mind, if you want to sort of diagnose the difference. So, and this might be a tricky question, but just answer whatever comes to you. So what would you say, compared to most of the other interventions that are on offer out there in the world of personal professional development, what would you say is the difference about quality of mind and its before psychology approach?
I think the sort of the big difference is that, you know, quality of mind, the potential is so big. But it's also, you know, it's not like a craft training course, or, you know, or a kind of very specific behavioral sort of technique, you know, kind of training. It is about seeing the world in a different way, and seeing, you know, how you act in it in a different way. And therefore the massive benefit of that is that if you do it, if you commit to it, and it works for an individual or a group, and generally it tends to work, in my experience, for the great majority of a group, and when it works for an individual, it works very powerfully indeed, then it becomes not simply something that you do for 3-4 days and you get a benefit from for the next sort of few months, and then there's a half-life that decays quite fast. Yeah, it becomes an organic thing that becomes a part of the experience of all those individuals, but it also becomes a part of the discourse that they have between them, and, you know, the thing that they share in common, and it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. And for the people who have been in, you know, in that leadership group, who've been most affected by it, it's been a kind of continual growth, as opposed to something which, you know, had an effect and then was kind of gently forgotten. You know, it will be with them. It'll certainly be with me for hopefully as long as I'm around. And I think for some of those others in that group, it will be as well.
And do you see that there's any areas of business or I guess life in general that it isn't relevant for?
No, I mean, I think, you know, because the sort of the rationale is that, because it's about how the individual, you know, sees themselves in the world, and how they see the people around them, and how they interact. You know, any form of business that involves, you know, sort of decision making that's affected by quality of mind is relevant. But crucially, any form of business that involves those things in a collaborative or shared context is particularly relevant. And that's why I was attracted to it in the first place, and why I think it did have such a sort of considerable power for us, because we are a collaborative, creative business that thrives off better interaction, better sharing of ideas, better sharing of trust between people. And if that, any business, and most businesses, frankly, are in that area to a certain extent now, I think those businesses are particularly relevant for it.
And what about areas like people's well-being, psychological safety? So some of the sort of nowadays organizations are more, I think a lot of them genuinely interested in the whole person approach rather than just hard-nosed business results, which you've proved it brings. But what about for mental health, psychological safety, those things, well-being? How would you say it helps that?
Well, I think it does, in the way that we've sort of already talked about, in terms of the sense that it it certainly has given me, that you're much more in control of your world, is a massive empowerment. And that, so particularly in times of stress, and sort of fear, that's very, very useful. But also this sense that, you're not alone, that there is a sort of, not only a universal intelligence, but also, on a micro scale, if you open yourself up more to the people around you, you'll channel their sort of goodwill and intelligence and sort of talent as well. That I think is hugely beneficial on a sort of, that applies to families, friendship groups, as well as businesses, and a sense of not needing to analyze everything. We live in a very information rich and deductive sort of society, and if you allow yourself to be more intuitive and more impressionistic in the way that you react and take decisions, that can be fantastically liberating as well, again, in personal relationships as well as professional ones.
Yeah, and I think where organizations now are looking more at the whole person, and genuinely so, what I love about quality of mind is it bridges both. It's a gift to the individual for their parenting, their relationships, their attitude to the world in general, but of course then it has the beautiful business benefits as well. So
no, and I think, look, that's the way that we looked at it, in terms of justifying it originally, was to say, it's really hard for us as a business, even a good business, to say we're going to hire people who are significantly better than any of our employees, and it's very hard to give them knowledge that is superior to any of our competitors. So we've got to focus on how they are in themselves at any given moment. And that we didn't think of it then, I think, as a whole person approach, because that phrase was probably not sort of in sort of currency, but actually it was a whole person approach. Generally, people who are feeling safe, people who are feeling confident, people who are feeling loved, have better ideas and interact better with the people around them than people who are feeling insecure, unsafe, and kind of not appreciated. So it's, I think it's the two things are incredibly closely interwoven, because business in almost every sense now is a highly people orientated activity, and therefore people who are feeling better about themselves in the world are better at it.
So in a marketplace like Marcoms, which is quite competitive for talent and clients, what role would you see in quality of mind in helping you both with talent acquisition, talent retention, and even maybe clients as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that without creating a kind of sense that if you come to McCann, say, you're joining a cult, the fact is that if you're coming to work with a group of people who clearly enjoy working with each other, and an elite, in the good sense, highly productive, highly kind of effective team, that I think is massively seductive to talent, both as an acquisition thing, but also as a kind of retention mechanism. And and the fact is that it used to be possible, I think, to sort of say, well, unashamedly, we're going to run quite a brutal sweatshop, but you will produce some good work. And I think the sense in the last half decade is that that's a very hard thing to run for a long time. You can maybe do a couple of years of that, but it takes its toll. And if you want to kind of create more corporate sort of continuity and a better sort of sense of kind of esprit de corps over a long period of time, you have to find a way of being, elite and effective, productive, which is not so bruising to the people engaged in it. And I think the quality of mind approach is a much lighter touch. It's a much more natural way of doing that than simply relying on willpower alone.
Great. So if we change tack slightly and now track the listener who might be thinking, okay, well, this all sounds very good, almost too good to be true. A little bit of that slight skepticism coming in. How would you answer the question? Well, why isn't everyone doing this? Why haven't I heard of this before? Why is it not the norm? Now, put the Marcom's limitation of quality of mind aside for the moment. But why leaders might be thinking, well, this is so great. Well, why is it not norm?
Well, I think, if I think about myself, it took me, I would say, 15 years to get to the point of individual confidence or don't care, to sort of to take this risk, because I've been thinking about things like this for a long time, but hadn't had the courage, simply, or the belief to kind of say to a leadership group around me, I really think we should, I feel we should do this, and and I think it's going to be very effective. And it took until the last 10 years of my career to get to the point where I had enough belief to overcome that sort of innate skepticism or fear of looking like a sort of a drifting hippie, in terms of introducing something which didn't have a kind of immediate mechanical sort of effect. So I think taking the risk, which in this case was enormously productive. I wish I'd taken it 10 years earlier rather than, I'm very glad I took it now, but I wish I'd done it 10 years earlier, because it would have been, made for a much more effective previous decade. And I think, the sort of we work in a very, we live in a very scientific and mechanistic way of thinking about the world. And it's fundamentally, our kind of understanding of business is fundamentally based on technique. Better technique equals better results. And the idea that you can do something so basic as to change, the way that you feel about the world and the way you think and the way you make decisions at a kind of precognitive level almost is a tough one to grasp. The fact is that that's why it's so powerful, because it at a level which is way deeper than most of those technique things. But because we think about the world in that way, it's difficult to kind of escape from that when you're contemplating spending, sort of precious time and precious money with people whose opinions you care about as a leader, to do that. But all I can say is that we're in a period where risks are becoming, I think, more essential. Taking risks is not really a luxury anymore. I think taking productive, calculated, thoughtful risks is necessary to make businesses and make individuals better and more productive. And this is a very good risk, in my view.
And we often get, I think you might have even told me this 6 years ago when I suggested it's 3 days. You're like, oh, does it need to be 3 days? Can we not do it in a day and a half? Skim out the stuff that's not important.
Yeah.
And so I always ask people, does it need 3 days? I mean, what would your view be?
Yeah, the fact is that it absolutely does need 3 days. I mean, certainly, I think, over the years that we've worked together, we've done sessions which are a little bit shorter, as the groups sort of become more attuned to the process. But I don't think we've ever done anything much shorter than 2 days. And I think, you need, well, two things really. You need the sense of leaving the sort of the mundane, the everyday, the business as usual behind for long enough to open your mind up to the possibility of new things. But crucially, in order for people to go through a transformation that may involve an initial period of confusion, skepticism, rejection, but then acceptance, you need enough time to work through those processes. And, I remember very clearly at the end of day one in our first session, thinking, my God, no one has a clue what we're doing. I'm not sure if I've got a clue what we're doing. I'm not sure if this is going to work. And then on day two, the magic started to happen. And by the end of day two, I think, the believers were, and the people who were sensing that things were being transformed were massively outnumbering the others. And on day three, we had an incredibly productive look at our future, armed with that new understanding. So you have probably, I don't know, 200, 220 working days in a year, so 3 is kind of 1.5% of them. And frankly, if you can give up 1.5% to get an extra 15, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and I think, and that's, I always say it's about the value proposition. And you said very nicely earlier that this will be with you till the rest of your years. So actually, you need to depreciate that 3 days over the rest of your life, which for some people would be 70 years, and some people might be 20 or 30. So really, I understand the reluctance businesses have for 3 days when they think the benefit might be small.
And I think the other way of putting it to businesses is that, if you're doing this collectively, and clearly it needs to be done collectively, then the other power of the 3 days is simply the shared experience. It's sort of that sense of being together and just seeing the quality of what you're doing in the training. So when you've got, a transformative process and that length of time, it's incredibly effective.
So if you were giving other leaders in the business world some advice, which you might formally be doing now in a role, I don't know, where would quality of mind or the direction it points to be featuring in that advice?
Well, I think if you're prepared to take the leap, then potentially quality of mind underlies all the other good things that you can do, because unquestionably it makes individuals more effective, but it also creates this much greater sense of, it opens people up to the power of a collective, and it also gives them something very strong and positive to share. So I think that any business that I was working with in future, I would always bring it up. I would always kind of say, this is a very interesting thing to consider that I've found enormously effective. Ultimately, people have to, you can't, as you know, Piers, very well, you can't sort of drag people kicking and screaming into it. They have to be open enough to make the decision to want to do it. But, I think it's an enormously powerful tool for life as well as for business.
And why do you think people are, and I do believe it's quite innocent, resistant to it when they first maybe come across it? Well, what is it about our society, our conditioning, our programming? So what is it about that resistance that you see now?
I think it's if you're kind of in sort of any form of, middle age or anything, but probably anything beyond, sort of 25 or 30, then you own quite a lot of the past in terms of the way the world is, the way you are, the way things work. And even if you're sort of not conscious of that, you start to become a defender of the way things have been and the way you've done things. And so the idea of saying, well, there's something transformative that actually replaces some of those ways of feeling and thinking about the world and being in the world is quite threatening, because there's a sense of, but I've done okay in this way, and if I take this on, then in some way I'm undermining myself. So I think you have to be sufficiently motivated to kind of, you either have to be sufficiently confident or sufficiently sort of hungry to to kind of want to question things. And all societies, I think, are predisposed to not to question things too much, simply because it becomes uncomfortable. But this is one of those occasions when I think it's really worth it.
And I think, I always often describe there needs to be an intellectual humility.
Absolutely. Yeah. You've got to be able to, you've got to believe that the way things are is not the best way. It's not the perfect way. And things are susceptible of improvement. And then I think that's a very, I think your phrase, intellectual humility, is very good, because if you say, I know what I know, but that's not necessarily the only thing that there is to know, then it becomes possible.
Yes. And what is wonderful and what I love about the job is taking someone who is quite closed and watching the melting happening, which can happen quite quickly, as you say, maybe from day 1 to day 3 on a workshop, because one has the capacity to see what we're pointing to, even if they are quite thick with thought, that can dissolve. So it's not like, oh, they're never going to get it. And I've been beautifully surprised sometimes by the people who have woken up. And that's lovely to see. So there is hope for all of us and society, I guess.
Yeah. No, and it's one of those things where, if you start thinking about it on a society-wide level, then it becomes extraordinarily powerful. I've viewed it as a sort of individual and kind of business kind of advantage. But if you thought about it being taken up in a mass way, then it becomes, enormously transformative on a global level. It needs a critical mass of people saying, this is something you've really got to look at, think about, and experience in order for that to start happening.
And I think you're right. There's almost a piece before the intellectual humility, which is sort of a cousin to it, where you have to want to be interested to start with. So I think life is so busy for many people. They have 100 emails coming in an hour, and to spend 2 minutes, 5 minutes looking at a video on this kind of stuff, they're just like, well, I haven't got time to do that. Because that video is probably not going to change my life. So why would I watch it? So it is, there's the slowing downness to have the intellectual humility. And I think a lot of people are just, that they can get intrigued for a bit, but that intrigue doesn't last. They don't get sticky intrigue. That they just kind of get, oh yeah, maybe I'll put that in the maybe pile kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and look, there's a sort of a sense of kind of self-worth in, but my schedule, it's so full, and that sort of tends to discourage people also from kind of taking a moment out to look into the unknown, so because it's kind of, it's both sort of fearful because it's not the familiar, but it's also fearful because, well, supposing I did do this, what would I be giving up of what I already am? There's sort of, I think, that we shouldn't underestimate the degree of kind of loss aversion that people have, however misplaced it is. And that's, that's, you've got to get past that in order to try something new.
Mark, we're probably sadly coming towards the end of our time. And I just really appreciate the richness of this conversation, and we could carry on forever. But to bring it to sort of an end, there's a couple of questions. One is, I always ask people if there were 3 words or short phrases you would use to encapsulate quality of mind, what would those 3 words be? And then the other question is, what are your final thoughts on telling other people in the business world about the value and relevance of this? So anything to sort of encapsulate it in even into a soundbite, what would that be?
Yeah, I think the sort of the words that the ones that we've probably already used, but that sense of being open to the world, but also feeling that you make the world as opposed to the world making you is, I think is are the two sort of big empowering forces. You can make what today is, as opposed to today making you. And that, because it's ultimately, it's all, it is all in creation. And that I think is hugely sort of powerful for me. And this sense of being in the moment without fear about what's going to happen or any emotions about what has happened is another sort of, big thing that I try and sort of hold on to. Because I think it's so valuable. And I think telling other people in business about it, the sort of, it's we're in a world of incredible competition, of enormous information kind of overload, and and getting better information and getting better resources is incredibly difficult. But if we can get 15 or 20% more out of the people we work with, if we can make them feel 15 or 20% more engaged about being where they are, doing what they're doing with the people they're doing it with, then that, and I've seen it, that transforms businesses, that transforms the way companies work and the way they produce results. And the quality of mind has the sort of key to making the people you're already working with so much more, and therefore the organization so much more. And that's why it's like the hydrofoil on the boat. It creates this sort of extraordinary uplift in performance with comparatively little effort. Once you get past the point about believing the hydrofoil won't work, if you can believe in hydrofoils, then you can believe in quality of mind.
Well, that's a beautiful description to leave it. So I want to thank you again for your time, because I know you have a busy and full day. So thank you so much for coming on, Mark. And I think this episode will be incredibly useful for people in the business world and not. So I want to thank you. And also just to say, I've absolutely loved the last 6 years of working with you. I feel very grateful to do my job, and you've been the most wonderful client. So thank you for that as well.
No, and look, it's been a great partnership, and one that I very much hope continues.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you. So, listeners, have fun being curious, and catch you next time.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast and want to know more, check out our website at qualityofmind.biz, and also feel free to reach out and leave us a review or a comment. Until next time, have fun being curious.